Hi everyone. I'm David LaMagna. I went to the Master Naturalist training not this past fall, but the one before that. And I've moved on a couple of degrees. What do we call them? The levels since then. Um, you can find me on iNaturalist. I do a lot of observation posting there. I also use eBird. Like I keep my bird life separate on eBird. But if you're curious as to like other observations I've seen, you could look me up on iNaturalist there. I live on Long Island, and it's on Long Island, not in Long Island, right? And I originally gave this presentation for an organization called Rewild Long Island. So it's going to be, and long story short, I just presented this for the first time, maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I emailed Christy and said, I'd had this presentation if you need a speaker, and then lo and behold, I guess there was some scheduling change, and here I am. So the presentation is still kind of skewed to Long Island, but certainly it applies everywhere. The main target audience for this original presentation is more of individuals that live in suburban housing. So if you are in a more rural part, or maybe in a more densely populated city, there's different degrees here. And I try to cover all that because even on Long Island, there are dense suburbs and then more rural and even agricultural areas on the East End. So I try to uh, kind of give a big blanket here. And the target audience isn't necessarily people that are master naturalist volunteers. So this was originally aimed for just the general public. So Rewild approached me and they asked if I could give a presentation on winter wildlife support or what to do for wildlife in your yard during the winter season. So here it is. Here it is. So I was able to change this slide. And so I'm not quite sure why they asked me to do this talk, but it got me thinking about, what's the overall goal? And the idea be in the organization focuses a lot on native plants and native gardening. So, and with the goal of supporting native wildlife, right? So to support the native wildlife of New York for us. But then that starts to think about like, well, what does that even mean, right? There's a tremendous amount of insects. On a listserv with some hobby lepidopterists, and even the number of moths and butterflies in the state is not known. And besides lumps and splits, there's still things being discovered or things moving in as the climate changes. So there's a tremendous amount of moths and butterflies alone, but then just all the insects, hundreds of different bird species, some migratory, some resident, right? Different fish if you are near a body of water, crustaceans. We have reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and everything, right? So there's a tremendous amount of wildlife. And I think the starting point about thinking about what you could do on your property is first just coming to grips with the fact that you can't support them all because New York is home to a diverse array of different habitats. And only a couple of things are going to be found where you are. So in the background here, right, we have the level four EPA map for the state of New York, and there's different regions and even within that, right, even lower, there are unique habitats within these habitats. So the first thing I would suggest is starting with like a walk, right? What Thinking about the natural spaces that are around you and any crumbs of habitat that might still exist if you're in a more uh, built up location. What type of habitat was supposed to be there? Are you near a saltwater coastline or a freshwater coastline? Are you near a pine barren system or a rich hardwood forest? Um, I put a bullet here like, does your property have a water feature or flood in a certain way, right? Is it marshland that was filled in, and can you perhaps restore a little bit of that? So visit those spaces. I don't think I need to tell this group, right? Get outside in the winter time. There's plenty around. There's plenty to explore even when it's cold out. and then see what they look like and try to emulate that back at your house, right? So a lot of times with the native gardening, especially with people that are dipping their toe in it for the first time, they want everything, right? Because there's so many cool flowers, there's so many cool shrubs, and they want this, that, and the other thing. And I was guilty of that too. And it becomes this hodgepodge mess that doesn't necessarily reflect what that habitat is supposed to be. And sometimes we're trying to fit like squares into circles. So go around near your house, see what the types of plants are there, think about the types of features that are around, and what can you bring back into your slice of paradise. Okay. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and the conversation we were having before we started, I think kind of keys into this. The idea with Rewild Long Island and other organizations, right, is to restore and rewild and not just help. So I always try to make like a case for making sure we're not just being do-gooders, but that we're actually doing good or well, whatever the English teacher would say. Um, So we want to focus on improving landscapes, and that restores the chances of wild creatures just naturally being able to survive and in our constructed world throughout all seasons, right? And part of that, to me, one of my biggest concerns when talking to the general public was about like supplemental feeding of wild creatures. And we were just hearing a story from Edie about bears in her yard. That's something that didn't even cross my mind because we don't have black bears on Long Island. But thinking about, the plants are going to be your bird feeders in a sense. So when possible, I'm not saying never feed birds, but thinking about the bird feeders and the types of mix that you're putting out there. There are some companies that make, and a lot of them are kind of local companies that make bird seed mixes that are from native plant seeds, which I thought was great. Um, there's a park on Long Island where the birds have this learned behavior to land in people's hands, and you could see a chickadee here. And if you've watched them feed at a feeder, right, they're sweeping away the stuff they don't want, and a lot of times that's millet or bits of corn or whatever. But the millet and other things might become themselves a problem because they're not a native uh, grass or whatever. And again, when it comes to the mammals, being careful about putting out cans of food or things like that, because we don't want to habitualize other creatures to the human presence. It could cause conflict. It could cause disease transfer. Um, the more they're comfortable around human habitation, it could increase road mortality. And we want to make sure we're avoiding natural or native species becoming pests. I'm thinking of like squirrels or flying squirrels in people's attics, things like that, and attracting the more undesirable species like house mice and rats. So again, the focus of the talk in general was about restoring nature, not just helping. Um, so the thing that comes up all the time in the fall is is the leaves themselves, right? And the general public always has the hysteria about the leaves and putting them in bags and stuff like that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but I think everyone here knows that leaves serve a purpose. In a deciduous wood, right? The ecosystem has evolved with itself in a in a back and forth over the eons, adapting and those leaves becoming soil for those same trees and so on. But it's important to realize that they serve their cover for species year round. So here's some pictures from my yard, and I wanted to include some of the dates, right? So there's still, 2 years ago, there were still milkweed bugs active in December. I know down here might be a little different than the Adirondacks. I found this litter moth caterpillar this is just a species of litter moth. I don't know which one exactly. Apparently, they feed on dead leaves, which I thought was really cool. And finding that in January like blew my mind. We have spring peepers here. So they provide camouflage. Right here's this Renia moth here. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Renia. And then the leaves also insulate the ground, right, for ground nesting bees. Remember, the vast majority of them either are in the ground or in twigs and stems. We'll get to that later. Um, and the leaves serve a really important purpose for that. Then there's the cycling nutrients, building soil, and there's the important thing of suppressing unwanted plant growth, right? They're a natural mulch. And again, what is that environment where your home is? What are those leaves doing? What are they? They're helping keep down certain things so that the native plants that are specific to your area can thrive. Okay. So the what to do conversation about leaves. This is kind of like in descending order of what can be done. Um, but there's some people that are very religious about leaving them where they are. And I think my answer uh, is that everyone's answer is different. There is somewhere between keeping 0 to 100% of the leaves on your property. That's the right answer for you. But here are your options from probably most desirable to least desirable. So leaving them exactly where they are. For people that are in very suburban areas, that might not be reasonable, or just because the sheer amount of it. Um, but you could pay attention to where they go in your yard. Do they tend to accumulate in an area? And if so, can you now design your landscaping to go with that, right? Can you take advantage of the wind doing that work for you? Okay. If you have the space, can you move the leaves into one area and create a large brush pile? I would note though that I've never really, different woods are different, but very rarely are there piles of leaves that are many feet deep, right? So again, we're starting to move toward the unnatural solutions here. Moving them purposely into garden beds and using them as mulch themselves, or different hugel methods of layering leaves underneath soil to so they could decompose or they have contact with soil microbes, whatever that might be. Shredding and mulching the leaves themselves helps keep the nutrients, perhaps, but it does possibly damage the creatures that are living in there, right? Those camouflaged cocoons and other things that are hiding amongst the leaf litter can be potentially damaged in that process. Um, Honestly, I do that sometimes. It just makes them more manageable. It's easier for me to move them into the spots where I want them to be. Okay. And then there's bagging them for complete removal, right? So if you're someone needs it to go down, you just need it to go down to 0 of the leaves on your property. Thinking about putting them in paper over plastic, if they're going to be landfilled. I think this step here is important conversation to have with your municipality. What is the end use of them? Are they going to a landfill, in which case they're going to be decomposing in anaerobic conditions, creating methane, contributing to climate change, right? When they should have been building soil and fertilizing the plants in your yard. But there is a town on Long Island, town of Islip, I know of for sure, because I take my students there on field trips, where they collect clippings from the yards in that community and they do compost them. And they do, and this is a picture from I take my kids every year, and this is like a picture from like when I was in a college class at Stony Brook. So I don't know, I've never taken a picture since, but they do a really good job, and they have pretty state-of-the-art equipment to make sure plastic's removed and stuff like that, and it's free pickup for homeowners. Um, so somewhere in between here, maybe a mix of these is right for you. And again, those of you with bigger properties, this might not be an issue this might not be something that comes across someone's mind. But this is certainly a conversation here on Long Island with a bit of a denser grouping of houses. Um, somewhere in the middle. Again, I'm not crazy religious about the just leave them where they are because there are negatives, right? And I feel like sometimes this conversation gets muddled and people put blinders on that, oh, if you remove a single leaf from your property, you're the worst. But there are significant things to consider. Um, they're hazardous. Um, when it rains, they become slippery on walkways. Um, Dry leaves and tinder are a fire hazard, and I'm sure that's a big concern. Fire is a concern on Long Island, and I'm sure it is in the rest of the state as well. Um, choosing your battles. Is it worth having a yard that looks a little unkept to your neighbor's eye? Um, or with your spouse or significant other or whatever. Um, this is a real picture of the drain at the bottom of my stairs, and I have yet to clean them up since I took this picture like a month ago. But they can clog storm drains, which can lead to flooding. So this is something when there's a big rain event, my wife and I make sure that this is cleared out. And this is an issue also just for municipalities and the storm drains in the road, right? So if you're leaving your leaves on the yard and they're blowing off into the street and they're clogging storm drains in the road, that could be an issue. The smothering of other plants, right? If you're trying to foster some sedges in your yard, or perhaps violets or spring ephemerals, too thick of a layer of leaves might be a deterrent to them in a garden setting. Um, Newly planted garden plants are not necessarily as robust as I don't know, a forest of trilliums that have the energy stored up to be able to push through a leaf layer. So smothering is certainly an issue, especially if you mulch them. That kind of lowers the volume. I've found it's not as airy, and it makes a pretty thick mat after it rains a number of times. And then I only really learned about this relatively recently, and I think the jury's a little out on this, but there is some alleliopathy issues from uh, an invasive like Norway maple. That if those leaves are falling, if you have a Norway maple or a neighbor has a Norway maple, and those leaves are falling in your property, there is a chance, I think this is still kind of an area of study, that by leaving those leaves, you might be deterring the growth of some natives or some other plants that you're trying to encourage in your yard. Um, so to be realistic about the leaves, I think is important. Again, everyone's answer, you know your property, think about your surroundings, and what's the right number between 0 and 100 of the leaves that fall on your property for you. Okay. And something else to keep in mind is that nature doesn't just keep everything. Um, Good land stewardship requires active management, and this is a large private piece of property on Long Island um, where they hire a company to do a burn. Um, the nutrient is here, but a lot of the carbon mass is going to go up in smoke, literally. That year after year after year in a healthy, knowing your type of habitat. In some habitats where there is a fire regime, 100% of the material is not kept there year after year after year, right? So again, this idea of just letting everything build up forever does not necessarily reflect every habitat. Um, but this was a really cool aerial photo, so I had to get that. Um, and I'm not recommending that people burn their yards. Just also, I think that's an important thing to stop and say. But just something to think about that good land stewardship requires active management when the human presence is around. Okay. So then thinking about that walk. Um, what's out and about. What else can we incorporate into yard? So we're going to deal with the leaves on how we see best. We're going to plant accordingly with what's native to the area. Okay, what are some other features that can be incorporated even on smaller suburban or even urban lots. And keeping large logs and large sticks um, is it a good feature to have, right? It could be used as edging to help define spaces and maybe give a garden bed a rustic look. It could be incorporated into the center of plots, and sometimes, I've seen some people that keep very large stumps and they put planters on top of that to give some height, just as a design feature. Um, and the logs and sticks are important. They provide winter locations for pubation. They provide cover from predation. They're just part of life cycles, part of for hibernation or torpor or whatever it might be. There's whole ecosystems under logs and bark. And Christy might remember, like I'm a flipper. I like flipping things because there's a whole world underneath there. And this is just a small sampling of all the cool critters that are there. Finding I don't, what's the English name for this? A Agochlora aura green sweat bee, metallic green sweat bee, under a log in the winter, under a piece of bark, in the wintertime, which is so cool because it's sitting there and you could really just like get a cool look at it. But right there's reptiles and amphibians that might be active that time of year, depending on the temperature. Um, I think most famously, morning cloak butterflies overwinter as adults. So having hollowed logs and things like that on the ground or standing trunks, we'll get to in a minute, are important overwintering spots for them. There's so many cool things uh, just under bark and under the logs. Okay, and rocks too, right? I put this in here originally not knowing I was going to do the this talk for Master Naturalist, but I threw it in there because the day with Marla at the Naturalist training was like the funnest day ever. So this is like a secret shout out to her. I don't know who else got to experience her digging through the grass during the at the Arnott, but that was a wonderful experience. But under rocks, there's plenty of cool things as well. Again, I threw in some dates here. I guess I was very busy and bored in January of 2023. But all sorts of critters are are moving about when it's cold out. Um, and you could include these features in any landscape. Now, the big thing when with the talk to the kind of the group I was talking to originally is everyone loves birds, right? So, it's hard to get people excited about the creepy crawlies and the slimies and all that. But people love birds, right? Some, a little bit more macro fauna people can feast their eyes with. And I've noticed over the years there's a lot of like misconceptions about what birds actually eat. Just because they're at a feeder in the wintertime doesn't mean they only eat seeds, right? And I think one of the biggest lessons from the native plant movement with Doug Talmy and others is that these birds are eating insects. Most of them, I'm talking with broad strokes here, being insectivorous at least some parts of the year, and the plants help feed that. And even brown creepers. I saw one on my tree yesterday. They're looking for little insects that are still out that are on the bark in the wintertime. So thinking that the diets of birds are varied. So aside from our predatory birds, they're either insectivorous, granivores, or frugivores, and many of them are combinations of both, or even all three. Um, Also, something else to think about is watching the birds as they change throughout the year. If you are putting out a feeder, right, seeing which ones kind of disappear in the spring as their diets change and they're not necessarily in just survival mode they're in breeding mode and they're rearing chicks and things like that. And sometimes leaving out a feeder, especially into the summertime, especially downstate here, um, the only thing that starts to show up are uh, house sparrows and starlings. And feeding the some of the most notorious invasives isn't necessarily the best idea. So thinking about berries now, this is kind of I'm using my knowledge from Long Island, and I'm sure there's some other examples upstate. Uh, I'm trying not to say upstate 'cause I know it's a charged word for people uh, north of Manhattan, in the rest of the state. Um, so thinking about the berries for the birds, the ones that exist, right? If we're focused on winter time habitats, right? And thinking about what's native in your area, thinking about which berries or fruits or nuts are formed later in the year. Not necessarily early, right? So it might be great to have service berries, one of my favorite genus of plants, and blueberries, but they ripen a little too early and wouldn't necessarily be available over the winter if that's like your main concern. Nuts are important because they get cached by mammals and birds like blue jays to be to be called upon later on. But thinking about what berries are forming when, and I think I'll get into that a little bit. Um, Thinking about the size and color of the fruits that are available, and I'll get into this on the next slide. But if you're buying native plants through the nursery trade, even though they're labeled as native plants, they're likely probably still cultivars, and they might be producing berries that are too large because these are cultivars for human landscaping, and we like nice, big, showy winter berries. So they might be too large for, say, robins or cedar waxwings to choke down, or they might actually just be the wrong color. Birds have an eye for red, not just hummingbirds, so that they're cued in, right? A lot of red berries are um, bird dispersal mechanisms. So making sure that the color is as close to natural as possible. When landscaping, thinking about the species more exactly, is it dioecious, meaning it has males and females on separate, male and female flowers on separate plants, as opposed to monoecious or perfect flowers. So, for example, like some of the most famous winter landscaping plants, at least down here, are the different ilex species, right? For Tessellata, winterberry, opaca for American holly, and glabra for inkberry. And then even things like bayberry down here, having a male may be necessary for fruits. Some of them might, I think bayberry might make sterile berries when it's just females, but um, either way, having a male helps with pollination. Um, and in general, if you do have wild type natives, having as many as possible helps increase the amount of fruit that's produced. So having multiple genetically unique individuals helps with cross-pollination, increases fruit production, and mass plantings is just more plants, more food, right? You might notice that this time of year, American robins are certainly more gregarious than when they're starting to just pair up in the spring or as they forage throughout the summer. Um, Generally, large flocks, they're going to queue into larger mass plantings to feed as a group. Um, so this was like another trapping of like the native plants, someone who's into it for the first time. It's like, I want this and this and this and this and this. Um, and it's really like a less is more situation that you want to focus on a handful of species that are correct for your location and then lots of that type. Um, So here's an example of a winterberry cultivar that's the wrong color. So it's not to say that like the birds won't eat it. It's just that they might not pick up on it or something like that. And this holds true for in Mount Cuba, if you're interested in this, does a lot of cool volunteer studies on the pollination of different echinacea cultivars, the pollination of different uh, um, hydrangeas. Um, there's all sorts of studies about just color that's attractive to pollinators, or in this case, we're talking about the berries in the wintertime for the birds. Okay. So if you are getting cultivars, right, then you do need to shop specifically for the males, um, because and they tend to be harder to find for whatever reason. So if you have cultivars of female type winterberries, you need that male, each species is different, but one male for every three or four females, I think is generally what the ratio is. I might be a little off on that. So there's popular male cultivars for um, winterberry, inkberry, and the American holly seems a little bit more difficult to find. But if you are planting wild type individuals, generally when you buy it from a nursery, they're too young to have maybe flowered or tried to fruit if it's a female. So a lot of plants are not sexed in the trade. And that goes for I mean, any sort of dioecious plant. Um, so again, that's where mass plantings help, where if you're, rolling the dice on having 10 wild type inkberries, you're increasing the chances of having good proportions of males to females and lots of genetic diversity for that fruit production. Um, I'm lucky enough I was able to find some wild type inkberries that were sold by Rewild. They do a plant sale in the fall and spring, and this is the flowers of a male inkberry that I have out front. And I noticed when I was putting up the Christmas lights yesterday, I have some berries on the females, but the plants are still pretty young. And also, if you're looking for a certain look, like you want like the winter berry in front of your porch, and then like one of them's a male, and it's just like standing there all twiggy in the wintertime, you could always move it, right? So like it, these things aren't set in stone either. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. So you could always move the plants later. Um, here's another one. And I think this is a more specific Long Island uh, thing. I'm sure eastern red cedar is throughout the state, but they're very common here on the island, and they do need they're wind pollinated, and they do need multiple, or you do need males and females, but they're common enough here where they are a popular landscaping plant as an evergreen. But there are other concerns about apple cedar rust and things like that. And right, so technically those are cones, not berries. Here's a list. Again, this might be a little bit specific to downstate, um, but some other late producing berries. Again, go on a walk and see what's around you in those wild spaces that are left. Maple leaf viburnum down here, red chokeberry. I noticed the black chokeberry generally gets wiped out pretty much immediately, and that's a very early burying plant where I am. Some of our sumacs, Virginia creeper does make berries. If you want to go on to expert mode, and you can foster some smilax, some catbrier. I say expert mode because that's going to have thorns, and it's not a typical landscaping plant. I think those berry pretty late. There's lots of different species around the state. Okay. At the same time, when we're talking about feeding berries to birds, we also need to make sure that they're the right ones. Um, so I think this is a pretty famous example with the heavenly bamboo. that these berries, again, they're red. The birds are going to queue into them, but they are toxic to them. And I think one of the more famous stories is like a flock of cedar waxwings died from them. That kind of like got everyone's attention, if I'm recalling that properly. But this is a well-known one. So at the same time that you're fostering native species, you want to be removing these toxic non-native ones. We're talking, if it's planted in a municipal park or something like that, getting more involved and making sure things like that are removed. Another one, and the jury seems to be out a little bit here, is are the yews, European and Japanese yew, right? We do have a native yew that does seem to be favored by deer, is my understanding. It is native to Long Island. I've never come across it, and it seems to be very hard to find in the trade. Um, but they're generally considered toxic to all animals. And again, that aril is again, it's not really a berry, but is potentially toxic to some. I don't know if it's going to cause a flock of birds to drop dead, but it's not native anyway. There are similar alternatives to it. Some more obvious things, right? So we talked about, there's the birds eat fruits, but they also eat seeds and just leaving them around, right? So again, this is a conversation to the public where, they're deadheading, I don't know if that's the right term, but they're cutting these grasses down in the middle or at the end of the season for whatever reason. But there's plenty of good seed heads on them. This panicum on the left is actually a specimen I have at the native garden at the school I teach at, and it's just gorgeous. It's huge. It's full of seed heads, and we frequently see all sorts of birds flitting about it. In the sedges, some of them might retain their seed bodies, and so on. And it's also important to think about, the grasses. Yeah, they're feeding. They might be the grasses, sedges, and rushes might be feeding the birds, but they're also now laying in wait for when the birds are ready to nest. And this is Carex albicans. I think it's the English name is like white tinged sedge, maybe. This one I love. This is a great landscaping sedge. This is actually around my pool. And just like those wispy hairs, you could see like a bird being like, "Yeah, I'm gonna build my nest out of that guy." So leaving that around, it doesn't necessarily need to be, this isn't something that needs to be cleaned up in the fall, because any seeds that are there are going to supply for the birds and help them with nesting material later on as spring approaches. Right? Um, so we did talk about like the birds that are eating seeds and fruits, right? But the predators also, again, a conversation in the suburbs about, leaving snags uh, uh, if it's not endangering, if it's not a threat to property or life, leaving large snags for birds to roost on or to hunt from. Um, and then a lot of this goes for mammals and even some bats down here in this season. Um, and then leaving large hollows also. If you're lucky enough to have some dead trees that are not a threat again to property, leave them up. And plenty of things make houses in it. I was super lucky to see this southern flying squirrel um, in the middle of the day. Uh, Yeah. So, you never know what's going to be inside, and that's great habitat. Again, when you're walking around those natural habitat, there's naturally dead trees and snags, right? It's not something you're going to go out and drag to your house. But if you have an older tree, again, off to the side, it's okay to just let it be. And, things are going to live under this bark also. It's great habitat for all sorts of critters. Okay. Um, Going along with the evergreen concept of for to provide cover for mammals or for owls or whatever. Um, This is always like a popular conversation. Again, this is going to be a very down Long Island specific list, which I think is pretty much holds true throughout the state. Um, this comes up all the time in like Facebook groups, stuff like that. What's an evergreen? What's an evergreen? I think, traditional landscaping, it's hard for people to move away from things that aren't evergreen. But here's just a general list. These are certainly rarer down on Long Island. I'm not sure if these are more common in the rest of the state. And then I had to include this pic. This is not during the summer. I had to include, did I put it on the list here? This is a picture of bearberry, right? This is would be a ground cover, and I had to include this picture because it had a Spiranthes orchid in it, uh, and it's just a cool nursery for to keep these orchids protected, I guess, during the other parts of their life cycle. So there's lists out there. You could check the New York State Floral Atlas for your location. And on the bottom here, I included coral honeysuckle. Again, I'm not sure throughout the rest of the state its status or not. I think there is a boreal honeysuckle, if I'm not mistaken. Same genus. I want to say it's Lonicera. Whatever. But I had to include a picture of it because this thing is always flowering. It's crazy. This was flowering, the snow on the ground here, January 7th. I'm not quite sure what the metabolic advantage of that was, or like why it does that, what it's calling to. Um, but it flowers and it's a cool plant. It's semi-evergreen as per the specific epithet of it, and it does produce berries. I have multiple individuals on my property, and there's a lot of good berries sitting out there right now. So it would fall under that late berrying thing, and a good pushback against all the non-native honeysuckle vines that tend to dominate landscapes. So it's a good reminder that there are native ones out there. I have it over a trellis, and I have like a big one on a fence. Okay. And then there's some more obvious things, right? Leaving seed heads, even the ones with wind dispersal. There's lots of seed on there still, and the birds are tripping around. So again, this is at the courtyard at my school, and we were out there today, and the juncos and goldfinches are out there, and the kids interact with them, but they could see them pretty clearly with your bare eye. No need for binoculars, stuff like that, because they're kind of everywhere. They really like the space. Um, Echinacea, seed heads, Monarda. This is Bisocarp, common nine bark. These bladder pods that develop pretty early in the season, and there's still seed inside them. This was only taken a couple of weeks ago. Okay. Some other suggestions for habitat. We mentioned earlier about, the leaves, and, leaving the sticks, or, if you're leaving these seed heads, the stems and branches are just naturally going to be there as well. Um, and specifically, plants that have very like pithy stems are great habitats for insects to go burrow into them. I'm sure there are other species that use hardwood, um, but the pithy stem species uh, are are more likely to have things, I would say. Um, so here's a list of, so this is what I mean by a pithy stem. So this is oh gosh, I can't remember what I opened up here. But it has this very soft inner layer, and insects can burrow in, excavate that, and either hide out throughout the winter or lay eggs in the chamber or in pupate and develop. I was outside by my pool and I saw this stem was broken, and I saw something moving in there, and it was this little Serratinia genus bee. This blue metallic, very cool little bee was inside there, excavating that stem. With students, we walked around the garden one day. I think this was last fall, and we were looking for holes in stems. We found one. We broke it open. I saw this frass, and then this little guy came out. Um, uh, whatever species it was. It was only like one other observation on Long Island on iNaturalist. So pretty cool, like rather unique experience to have with students. Um, my understanding is it doesn't really matter if the sticks themselves are in a vertical position or if you do knock them down or lodge them. If they're inside there, they're going to be insulated and everything should be okay, right? So if you don't want the height, you could lower them and add them to a brush pile or just keep them in place, um, wherever that might be. So again, here's some examples of some pithy hollow stem species that could be added to a suburban or any home garden there. Doing all those things probably helps with reptiles, amphibians also, right? The logs, the leaves. I was also reading, if you wanted to go expert level with some logs in your landscaping, to actually purposely kind of half bury them, and that should kind of undermine the soil enough that that it's a little bit softer and they could get in there. So I kind of purposely did add a number of these pictures on purpose. The leaves for box turtles, they bury themselves into that. Um, this garter snake was at the kind of at a hollow where some roots were coming out of the ground. These are not in my yard. Um, but I saw it come out of there in March, and it kind of did like this stretch roll. It was really cool. Like it was like waking up. Like saw it wake up from its winter den. Um, Underneath a log, this is a blue spotted salamander. This is a genetically pure one, special for Long Island. Um, Thinking about the substrate of your garden, your house, right? If this is a Fowler's toad, maybe, if natural locations around your area have like a sandy substrate, that's what's supposed to be there. And, try to maybe bring that back in a way and not worry so much about topsoil and mulch all the time. So again, thinking holistically about the surroundings and what type of habitat your home is in. And then getting crafty with it, right? So here's like a bug snug, right? If you don't want all those branches, you kind of make like a teepee, and then you could do alternating layers of those twigs and stems if you wanted to keep them on site, if you wanted to protect anything that might be living in them, or you wanted to create an insulated spot for insects. I don't know how much they actually like would go to that, but I'm sure something's surviving in there and not in a garbage bag buried in the earth. Um, so that's like a cute little thing, and this is only maybe like 2.5 feet tall, and it holds a tremendous amount of brush. You'd be surprised if you did. So if you have a large area to clean up, you can, quote unquote clean. You want to clean it up, quote unquote. There is you could fit a lot in a cute little teepee shape. I should get a better angle of that. The pine cone feeders. It's a rainy day. Some good quality seed mix. Lots of black oil sunflower in there. Um, so the feeding isn't terrible. It's again everything with a light touch, right? Um, and then just a little bit about you. You are finding stuff in your yard. You are going outside. What tools are available to you, right? There's iNaturalist, which I think I've brought up once or twice. There's Seek, right, which is approved for minors. It's Ed 2D compliant because it shields. There's privacy protections for minors. It's also maybe if you're not so tech savvy, this is a good intro app for people. You take pictures with your phone now, and you could swipe up, and kind of that center icon there will help narrow it down for you. It's not great, but they're pretty good. There's books still exist. There's field guides. That's what I learned from, or like Newcomb's field wildflower guide, the Nat Geo bird field guide. Um, so as you, as you get more curious about the creatures that are there, I think IDing them is part of the fun, or submitting them to websites like Bug Guide. I'll skip these. Okay. And then, it's important to think about, winter ends, right? Winter's not forever, right? This isn't like Game of Thrones or something where it goes on for like generations or whatever. No one really knows. Thinking about part of the excitement of wintertime is knowing when it comes to a close. So plant those early bloomers, things like uh, the willows. Remember, maple trees actually have flowers, right? They're angiosperms. They're just way up there. Serviceberry, your violets and other spring ephemerals. Um, Here's me in the middle of March. This is on my property. This Andrina bee on prairie willow. Oh, I wrote it right there. Yeah, prairie willow. Um, Spring comes, winter ends. So get excited for spring also. I think that's just as important. And then lastly, like, just go outside, right? There's feeder watch, someone mentioned earlier. This Christmas bird count's coming up. Uh, um, Sharing your observations to citizen science, right? There's so much to do and explore in the wintertime. So it tends to be a busy time of year, but getting outside is certainly some of the most enjoyable. And there's plenty of other things I did not include here, right? There's galls, which someone gave a great presentation about the other month. There's so many other things with organisms and stuff that could be supported in your yard. So like by keeping some of this brush, right? Those galls that might be there are going to be kept on the property as well. And that's it. How do we do?
Fantastic. Thank you, David. That was nice. Got me thinking about some other species I might want to add. I'm going to look for questions. If anybody has questions, you can add them now. Um, oh, Pete Saraceno was asking how you can tell if it's male when it's little, meaning the plants, but you addressed that. They can't really, so you have to kind of roll the dice and plant a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And again, if it is a cultivar, then you could either look that up, but most of the readily available cultivars tend to be females, is my understanding.
Okay. And then Dave Shepherd mentioned that you can also try cooperative extension and said that they got a good mix of male and female saplings of the local winterberry from them.
Okay.
Comments that black chokeberry is a starvation food, maybe? I just lost some of my
Which one?
chat. Black chokeberry? Is that like a famine food?
Yeah, I
Or is
actually
that the
find the
shade?
opposite, that black chokecherry is gone. The cardinals seem to really like it, and my red chokeberry will probably last throughout the wintertime. But it doesn't really get eaten. Interesting. So it's
Okay.
interesting, different areas are different.
Yeah. Pete, I think your audio is on. If you could mute that, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. Let's see. How late in the season is it too late to plant trees and shrubs?
I think as long as the soil's not frozen, you can
Mhm.
do it as, what I've been told. I'm not like a horticultural expert, but I mean, as long as you can work the soil, I think you're kind of good to go.
Probably varies by year a little bit, and certainly by
Yeah.
geography.
Hmm.
Okay. Eton asks, arborvitaes are native? Are there any animals or insects you know of that benefit from them aside from nesting space for birds?
Yeah, there's arborvitae weevil, which is like bright green. It's a rather large weevil, kind of blunt-nosed one. Um, And I'm sure it's a host to other moths and butterflies also. But yeah, it's a native. It's just like an overly used horticultural plant and deep into the clonal cultivars, right? Like green giant or whatever it's called. Yeah, but it is a native species. I think it's native throughout a lot of the state, if I had to guess. I know I've seen it wild up in like more northern parts of New England.
Yeah,
Um,
it's mostly up in around the
higher up,
Adirondacks and up into
yeah.
uh, you get much south of Poughkeepsie and it gets hard to find.
Yeah, it's hard to find here too. I think I know of, it's hard. Long Island is so developed and has such a difficult past. It's hard for me to ascertain if, things are wild or they were planted at some point. It's like an old manor property where there's one, and I can't help but wonder if it was actually just planted there. Um, but it is listed as native on New York State Floral Atlas and with Bonap also for Suffolk County at least.
Okay. Pete asked, does coral honeysuckle, which is blooming around this time, does it have any pollinators during the winter? Does it
No,
need
I don't know. It
pollinators?
gets it. That's what I was saying. It's just incredible. Like it doesn't make any like I don't know who it's calling to in the middle of winter time, but it puts out buds. I should check now if it has any. Um, how it behaves in the rest of the state might be different. It could be the, richer soil in a more of a traditional garden setting. Who knows? But it's very weird for it to spend metabolic energy putting out flowers for nothing to come to it.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just a banger of a plant. It's a good one.
yeah. Neat. And he also asked, how long do you recommend keeping last year's stems in the spring?
Different strokes for different folks there, right? For me, I don't know. I think sometimes we use it for tinder if we're gonna do like little backyard fire pit stuff. So I kind of just have it throughout the summer. Depends on how much you have too, so I don't, there's different answers for different people. Generally, though, I know the message that goes out to people here is waiting for temperatures to be consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And the idea then is that, most things have, at least things that emerge early in the spring have done so after a couple days of warm weather. Pete, your mic's on again.
Okay, let's see if there's anything else.
Maybe I see the black chokecherry is famine food. Maybe Shane, you meant for people is famine food?
Was that was that from Edie? I don't remember. I'll scroll back
The
and
famine
see.
food thing. Yeah, I know so again, like I see Miss Jennifer's comment about the
Oh,
50 degree
Shane, it
thing.
was Shane. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Shane, if you want to unmute, if you have a clarification for that, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I see Jennifer's comment about the 50
Oh,
degree thing.
I was referring to the white cedar.
Oh, I thought you said
Oh,
something about the black chokecherry.
Oh, you
Chokeberry.
were you were you were discussing the black chokeberry. I Yeah, I just heard that there was kind of no nutritional value in it, and that birds, you know, only ate it as a last resort. It's kind of like a famine food.
Interesting. I actually find it goes pretty fast in my yard. I'd imagine it's high in some nutrients just by, yeah, I don't know. But it goes quickly here. I'm surprised. Um, and then just to go to the 50 degree thing again. Yeah, I know. So like I showed that organisms are around all the time. That's kind of just a message to the general public because that generally takes us well into April, close to May, and give things as much of a chance as possible to emerge. But certainly there are going to things that are pupating longer into the summer before they come out.
all right. There's some more comments about the black chokeberries that they're good for pollinators too. Our red chokeberry gets devoured, but not until February or later
Hmm.
by birds, that is. All right. Some really great comments and some information dropped in the chat. There are no more questions. So, David, thank you so much. Thanks for jumping in to do this at the last minute. And thanks to everyone who joined tonight. This is our last Naturalist Exchange of the year. We skipped January, mostly because I will be away in Colorado. And then we'll come back in February and be ready to hear some more great presentations. So thanks to everybody who presented this year and to all of you for attending and giving your attention to the people who are sharing the great presentations. So thank you all and happy holidays if you celebrate and Happy New Year.
You too. Thank you.